Hello there, neighbors. Just a quick mention before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short-form content on TikTok and Instagram. So if you would be so kind, stop on over to either of those platforms and check it out. It's in the same vein as the things that I talk about on the podcast. Once in a while, there's some content there that's a little bit more lighthearted and comedic than the podcast itself, but I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, please like, follow, and comment if you would. Alrighty then, let's move on to the episode. It is rare, but every once in a while Congress does something so unusual, so strange, so almost medically concerning that you have to stop and check whether the building is still standing. Congress passed a bipartisan housing bill. Not a resolution congratulating a football team, not a ceremonial naming of a post office, not one of those bills where everyone agrees because the actual policy content could fit inside a fortune cookie. A real housing bill. At a time when rent is crushing people, ownership feels like a rumor from a previous civilization, and working families are staring at mortgage rates and down payments like they're riddles that they have to solve. Congress somehow managed to pass a bipartisan housing affordability package. And was it perfect? No. Was it going to fix the entire housing crisis by Tuesday? Of course not. But it was something. It was a real attempt to move policy in the direction of more housing, more affordability, and at least some restraint on large investors gobbling up single-family homes like they found a cheat code, which, despite all the rhetoric, is one of the major, if not the biggest, issue in the housing crisis right now. And then, when President Trump looked at this bill, looked at the country's, housing pain, looked at a rare bipartisan effort to do something useful, he said, in effect, not until I get what I want. Not until Congress gives me the Save America Act. That's the story here. Not just housing policy, not just election law, not just another weird day in the Capitol where everyone pretends the furniture isn't on fire because the fire has been there for so long that it now feels somehow pointless to mention it. This is governing by ransom note. Trump was handed a bill that could help people afford homes, and he turned it into leverage for political power. And that should tell us something very, very clear. Donald Trump's first instinct is not relief. It is leverage. It is control, survival. And if you want to understand where Trump's priorities really are, don't just listen to what comes out of his mouth when he's promising affordability. Watch what he does when affordability is sitting on his desk waiting for a signature. Because when the roof over your head becomes a bargaining chip, you're not being governed, you're being used. Happy Friday, neighbors, and welcome to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. A podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. I am still Don Spielis, and I am still your host. And today we're going to be talking about this bipartisan housing bill that Trump refused to sign, or at least delayed the signing of, because he wants Congress to pass his election bill first. But this is not going to be another episode about the SAVE Act. We've done that. We don't need to walk that entire road again. This is about something broader. It's about housing affordability and political fear, and what happens when a president treats economic relief like a hostage. because Republicans are trying very hard to sell themselves as the party of affordability, the party for the people. But when Trump had a bill in front of him that could actually help on that very subject, affordability, he didn't reach for the pen. He just threw a little tantrum. So let's start with the thing that gets lost whenever Washington starts to talk about housing. Housing is not just an economic indicator. It's not just a market. Housing is not just, a line in a campaign speech or a chart in some policy report or one of those words that gets tossed around by people in suits who say things like supply constraints, like the average person has a clue what that might mean. Housing is where we live our lives. It is where you try to sleep after a shift that took too much out of you. It's where your kids do their homework at the kitchen table. It's where you take care of an aging parent, where you recover from surgery, where you argue about bills, where you hide from the noise of the world for 5 minutes and try to feel like your life belongs to you. So when housing becomes unaffordable, it's not simply a financial problem. It is a life problem. And right now, for too many Americans, housing is not just expensive, it is suffocating. Rents keep climbing. Home prices have drifted so far out of reach for so many people that homeownership feels less like a milestone and more like folklore. A thing your parents talk about back in their day, a thing that used to happen, a thing that apparently existed back when a person could work a regular job, buy a house, raise kids, and not need a decoder ring or generational wealth just to afford it. I have kids graduating college, and I can tell you, as well as anyone can, that young adults are delaying moving out. They're delaying marriage, delaying having kids, or giving up on buying altogether because the numbers just don't work. And when the numbers don't work, all the lectures about responsibility just sound insulting. People are working. They are budgeting. They are skipping things. They're sharing apartments longer than they plan. They're moving farther from work. They're driving longer commutes because the only place they can afford is nowhere near the place that pays them. They're watching landlords raise rents while wages play catch up badly. And then there's the seniors, people who thought they had built some stability, only to find that property taxes and insurance and rent increases and maintenance and medical costs make fixed income a part of a bad joke where the punchline talks about being broke. Families are squeezed from both sides. Childcare on one side, housing on the other. Groceries in the middle. Every month turns into a little math cage match. The electric bill taps in. The car insurance climbs over the ropes. The rent shows up. And all of this sits underneath the political conversation. That is why housing affordability was on Congress's radar in the first place. Not because, it's a neat policy theme, not because it polls well, or because some consultant found that, kitchen table issues test better than democracy, although I'd be willing to bet that somewhere there's a guy with a graph and some data explaining exactly that. Housing matters because it is the foundation underneath everything else. If your housing is not stable, everything is unstable. Your job is harder to keep. Your health is harder to protect. Your kids' school life is harder to manage. Your relationships carry more stress. Your plans have to get smaller, and your patience wears thin. And the future starts to feel like something that belongs to other people. And this is where the government is supposed to matter. This is where, politics shouldn't be complicated. I mean, you know me, I'm one of those radical socialists, as I'm so often told, who believes government should stay the hell out of your personal life, but manage to show up when you're struggling. That's pretty much the long and the short of it. I don't need the government in your bedroom or your church or your marriage or your doctor's office, in your library or your, kid's haircut or whatever. But when millions of people are getting priced out of a stable place to live, yeah, I want the government to show up. I want policy. I want urgency. I need lawmakers to stop treating housing like a local zoning hobby and start treating it like one of the central economic crises of American life today. Because that's what it is. Of course, part of the problem is the people who deal with it don't live in a reality where housing is a worry, unless it's worrying about their third or fourth home. And to be fair, this is not a problem that one bill can fix. Anyone pretending otherwise is not someone you should be taking seriously. Housing affordability is tangled up in supply and zoning and interest rates and wages and construction costs and local resistance and corporate investment. Decades of policy choices that made housing both a basic need and a wealth building machine. How's that for an American contradiction? We say everyone needs a home, then we build a system where the value of some people's homes depends on keeping other people out. So no, the bill that's sitting on Trump's desk is not going to magically solve all of that. But that's not the standard. The standard is not whether a bill fixes everything. The standard is whether it helps, whether it moves the needle in the right direction, whether it takes the pressure on real people seriously. And that's what makes this whole thing so revealing, because at a time when housing is one of the things Americans are most desperate for their government to address, Congress actually managed to pass a bill with bipartisan support. That alone is weird enough to make you look outside for locusts. But then Trump had to decide what mattered more: a bill that could help people, or an unrelated election bill that could help him with a problem he has. And he chose wrong. Go figure. So let's talk about the bill itself. And I want to be careful here, because this is where, political commentary can get a little too excited and start putting a superhero cape on a piece of legislation. This housing bill is not a miracle. It's not a single piece of paper that's going to descend from Capitol Hill and, sprinkle affordability dust all over the place. And suddenly every renter gets a reasonable lease and every first-time buyer finds a starter home, for less than $400,000. But it is real policy aimed at a real problem. The bipartisan housing package, called the 21st Century Road to Housing Act, was backed by Republican Senator Tim Scott and Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, that combination alone should tell you something. Those two are not usually sitting next to each other, sharing a milkshake with two straws. When Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren can agree that housing needs action, maybe, just maybe, the problem has escaped the land of partisan nonsense. The bill passed overwhelmingly, 85-5 in the Senate and 358-32 in the House. That is not a narrow squeaker. That's a blowout. And the package is aimed at parts of the housing mess that actually matter: encouraging more housing supply, cutting through some barriers that slow construction and approvals, and maybe most importantly, putting some limits on large institutional investors who are buying up single-family homes. And again, this is not a Harry Potter spell, Housecum Affordicus, but it is meaningful. Because one of the major problems in housing is that we simply do not have enough homes where people need them and at prices people can afford. And while that's not the whole story, it is a big part of the story. When supply is tight, Everyone starts fighting over the same limited number of places to live, and the people with the least money lose first. That is not complicated. That is the musical chairs version of an economy, except the chairs are homes, the music never stops, and, private equity shows up early, with a clipboard. So yeah, if a bill tries to address supply, speed up parts of the process, and put some guardrails around investor behavior, it matters. And there is another reason this bill matters. Congress passed it. Now, I imagine that sounds silly, but it's not. We have become so used to Congress acting like a group project where everyone, just hates the assignment, and half the class forgot their notebook, and Lauren Boebert keeps eating the paste. And so now when something bipartisan actually passes both chambers by a huge margin, it's worth noticing. This is what people constantly say they want, right? They say they want lawmakers to stop the fighting and solve problems. They want the parties to work together to accomplish something. They want action on affordability. They want, they're tired of performative nonsense and politicians using everyday struggles as props while doing absolutely nothing about them. Well, here was Congress for once doing something that at least pointed in the direction of a real problem. And trust me, I'm not asking anyone to throw a parade for Congress. I'm not one for celebrating a group of people actually doing their jobs. But this is the contrast that matters. On one side, this bipartisan bill aimed at housing affordability, and on the other side, the president who saw that bill and decided it was useful not as housing policy, but as leverage. That's the hinge of this whole conversation. The question is not whether this bill would have solved housing in America. The question is why Donald Trump looked at a bipartisan affordability bill during an affordability crisis and decided that the best use of it was as a pressure tactic. That tells you more than the text of the bill does. It tells you what he values when choice is in front of him. And in this case, the choice wasn't subtle. Help move a housing bill forward or use it to demand election law changes. And Trump picked the hostage note. He was scheduled to sign the bill. Then the signing got canceled or delayed or whatever. And suddenly this bipartisan housing bill is no longer just a housing bill. Now it's a bargaining chip. Trump tied action on the bill to the Save America Act, his sweetheart election bill. And let me pause right here. I know that you might be thinking, or you're bracing for impact here. We're not doing another Save Act episode today. That road has been traveled. But for today, the important part is simple. The SAVE Act is an election bill. It's framed by Trump and his allies as election security. It includes things like voter ID, proof of citizenship, requirements for registration, tighter restrictions around voting access. Supporters sell that as protecting elections. Critics, including voting rights advocates, warn that these kinds of requirements make it harder for eligible voters to register and vote, especially people who don't have easy access to documents or who have complications with names and records and transportation or bureaucracy in general. That's the thumbnail. That's all we need to be thinking about in terms of the SAVE Act for this episode. What I want to talk about here is going to be long enough without relitigating every provision of the SAVE Act. The point is that Trump took an unrelated housing bill and said essentially, you do not get this unless I get that. That's the move. And for my money, it's a rather craven move. Because housing is not some spare piece of legislative furniture lying around the Capitol. Housing is not a decoration that you can move from one side of the room to the other while you're negotiating over something else. Housing is one of the central economic pressures in people's lives. And Trump demonstrated he could not care less about it. He treated it like collateral. He was handed a bill to help people afford homes, and he turned it into a ransom note for political power. That is not normal governance. That is not leadership. That's not some hard-nosed deal-maker routine where, the brilliant negotiator plays 9-dimensional chess while everyone else plays checkers, and the American people are supposed to clap because he moved a pawn into their rent payment. It's not normal, but it is Donald Trump. This is a president looking at something that could help people and asking, yeah, but how can this help me? That is the Trump operating system right there. Everything becomes leverage. Everything becomes loyalty. Everything becomes transaction. Everything becomes a test of whether the rest of the government will bend around his will. And like so many other things that this guy does and says, this is also like a warning. If a bipartisan housing bill can be held up because Trump wants an election bill, then what can't be held up? Disaster aid, healthcare, food assistance, infrastructure, veterans benefits, school funding, whatever. Once you accept the idea that basic public needs can be used as leverage for unrelated power grabs, you are not really legislating anymore. You're negotiating with the man who has his hand on the trapdoor lever. And the cruelty of it is that people with the least power are always the ones most likely to feel the delay first. Trump is one of those people I mentioned that does not personally experience housing insecurity. I mean, let's not pretend otherwise. This is a man whose entire public persona has been built around gold-plated rooms, golf clubs, branded towers, and pretending that taste is something that you can achieve simply by, adding more gold sconces from Home Depot. He is not worried about rent, his or anyone else's. He's not worried about a landlord raising the price again. He's not wondering if his kid will have to switch schools because the lease renewal is just too high. He's not looking at mortgage rates and realizing that the starter home he imagined has become, just out of reach. But millions of Americans are living inside that very kind of pressure. And when Congress passed something that could help, Trump just saw it as a tool. Even if the bill eventually gets signed, the act of holding it up still reveals the priority. A president who cared at all about affordability could have signed the housing bill and then fought for his election bill separately. He could have said, this housing bill helps Americans, and now I want Congress to take up election security. I, for one, would still think the SAVE Act is a needless farce of a bill, but at least the two fights would remain separate, as they should. But instead, he made housing relief conditional on his election agenda. And that is the whole moral indictment in a nutshell. Not that he has a voting bill, not that he wants to fight for it, though there's clear moral deficit there too, but more so that he looked at people suffering in a housing crisis and saw hostages. Now, if you have any doubt, Trump is still spouting the same lies about election security. Where the SAVE Act is concerned, he's something of a one-trick pony. But we're all supposed to pretend that we don't recognize the show. It is like hearing the first 3 lines of a song that you hate playing in the grocery store, and you know exactly where it's going, but you're still trapped in a long checkout line. This is about midterm fear. I am more sure on that point than about anything else in politics these days. And not ordinary midterm fear either. Not the normal political anxiety of a party that wants to keep control of Congress. Every party wants to win elections. Every party wants to have, the gavel for the various committees. Every party wants to control the agenda. That part is not mysterious. Ordinary competitive gusto doesn't explain things this time. Trump's fear this time, let's just call it what it is. Dread is more existential. It's exposure fear. It's investigation fear. It's subpoena fear. It's fear of a House committee chaired by someone who is not trying to protect him. Control of Congress is not just about passing bills. It's about oversight. It's about who gets called to testify. It's about who has to turn over documents. It's about, whether an administration gets to operate in the dark or whether someone turns on the lights and starts exposing things. And Trump understands that. Now, he certainly doesn't understand every detail of housing policy. He's made it quite clear he doesn't care to understand the mechanics of affordability. He probably doesn't know the current prices of things like bread or milk. And honestly, I would pay good money to hear a reporter ask him about that. But he understands power, and he understands self-protection. He understands what it means when his party controls the machinery that's supposed to check him. A Republican Congress can investigate his enemies. A Republican Congress can hold hearings about his grievances. They can turn oversight into theater and treat accountability like, disease. But a Democratic Congress, that's different. Democratic House or Senate could make his life much, much harder. It could investigate the comic book levels of corruption. It could dig into painfully obvious conflicts of interest. It could call out abuses of power, pull documents, demand testimony, make the administration answer questions in public instead of letting everything disappear into the fog machine on Fox News. That is what Trump is afraid of. Not just losing a few seats, losing his shield. And in that light, the housing bill starts to look less like a policy dispute and more like just a game piece on the board. Trump is not asking for an election bill in the abstract. He is demanding election law changes before giving his signature to a piece of legislation. A piece of legislation that already passed both chambers by overwhelming margins. He's tying a bill that could help people afford homes to a bill that could rewrite the rules of political participation. It's not subtle. He's desperately trying to stack sandbags around his own power before the storm hits. And this is where the panic becomes politically revealing. The GOP wants to project confidence. Of course they do. They want to talk like the midterms are going to be great. They want to say voters love our agenda. They want to insist the country is thrilled with, the circus wagon that this White House constantly travels on. They want to smile for the cameras and say that everybody's with them. But whether you believe the rank and file of the GOP, does it seem like Trump believes things are great? If the public is on board, why use a bipartisan affordability bill as leverage for election rules? If he's as confident as the GOP pretends to be, why does everything look like a defensive crouch? The party knows affordability is a problem for them. They know people are tired. They know the economy does not become easier to live in just because Trump says adjectives loud. They know that when rent is due, you cannot pay your landlord with, a Truth Social post. And Trump probably knows that too, but he's damn sure that if voters hand control of Congress to Democrats, the next 2 years could look very different. Less protection, more oversight, more questions, more documents, more hearings, more public scrutiny. That is why this moment matters. Trump's move is not simply a legislative tactic. It's an act that is much more desperate. Economic indifference in service of political survival. He is willing to gamble with housing relief because he's afraid of the midterms. And once you understand that, the rest of the story gets much clearer. Republicans are trying very hard to talk like they are the party of affordability, but their message runs into a wall. There's plenty of evidence that we could use to argue against their point, but in this moment, the clearest thing on the table is this. Donald Trump could not care less what average Americans can actually afford. Does that sound harsh? Well, good. It should. Because what is the softer version? That he cares deeply about affordability, but only after his election demands are met. That he feels the pain of renters and first-time buyers, but not enough to separate their needs from his political to-do list. That he's very concerned about the cost of living, provided the cost of living can be made useful to his midterm strategy. I mean, just let me ask you this. Has he said or done one thing in the last year and a half that would make a rational person believe that he cares about affordability? At some point, you have to stop sanding the edges of this thing down and just describe it as it is. A president had a bipartisan housing bill ready for his signature, and he delayed or refused that signature because he wants a flak jacket. That's it. That's the action. And the action tells the story. Not the slogans, not the rally lines, not the staged cabinet meetings where everybody brown noses and nods like their heads are on, a spring. The action. And this action says that affordability matters until protecting power is on the table. Then protection wins. And of course, this is not even the first time Trump has basically told us how little the financial situation of average Americans weighs on him. When he's focused on something else. He was answering questions in May about the Iran war and flat out said he does not think about Americans' financial situation when negotiating with Iran. Now, of course, his defenders say, well, that was foreign policy. That was war. That was national security. You can't reduce that to grocery prices. Yeah, okay, fine. I'm willing to grant that argument for the sake of discussion. Foreign policy is different. Negotiations with Iran are not supposed to be conducted, like a coupon strategy at Costco. But here's the problem. This time, the subject is not Iran. This time, it's housing versus his pet bill. This time, the question is not whether the financial pain of Americans should take precedence over, foreign negotiations. This time, the issue in front of him is literally affordability, housing affordability, the cost of keeping a roof over your head. The thing Republicans claim they're all so damn concerned about. The thing voters are begging politicians to take seriously. Well, from where I'm sitting, Trump doesn't appear to be thinking about Americans' financial situation. He's just thinking about protecting his own self. He said the quiet part out loud once. Now he's proving it by action. That's the connective tissue here. When Trump talks about affordability, it's branding. When he has a chance to act on affordability, it becomes leverage. There's a deep cynicism in that, and I don't mean the normal political cynicism where every politician claims to love working families so much that you start to wonder why working families still need 3 jobs to survive. I'm talking about a much more specific kind of cynicism. A politics where people's pain is useful only when it can be converted into power. The rent is too high? Good, blame the immigrants. Groceries are too expensive? I sympathize, blame Biden. If that falls flat, blame Obama. Housing is unaffordable? I realize. Now I'll use the bill as pressure for election law changes. There is always an angle, always a target, always a way to redirect the anger away from the people making the choices and towards the people Trump once blamed. That's why this affordability message is just so hollow, because affordability is not just something you say. It needs to be something you act on. If you care about people affording housing, you sign the freaking housing bill, and then you make your argument for whatever else it is that you want. If you care about people affording groceries, you stop pretending tariffs are magic beans that somehow punish other countries without raising costs on consumers. If you care about working people, you do not treat their needs like chips in a casino where the house wears your name in gold letters. This is the Republican problem in a nutshell. They want the language of economic populism without the obligations of economic populism. They want to sound like champions of the forgotten man while supporting policies that make life easier for the remembered millionaire. They want the lunch pail imagery, the factory backdrop, the photo op with the guys in the hard hats, the solemn nod about families trying to get by. And then when actual relief comes along, Trump asks whether it can help him. That can be called a lot of things, but it can't be called populism. And this is why the housing bill matters beyond the bill. It's a test. It's not a perfect test. It's not the only test, but it's a pretty clean one. Here's a bipartisan bill aimed at an issue people actually care about. And here is a president who says affordability matters. And here is the signature line. And instead of signing, he starts making demands. Could there be any clearer signal? It tells you that the affordability talk is cheap enough to buy in bulk. It tells you that average Americans are props. They're just props in the speech. They're not priorities in the decision. And it tells you that when Trump has to choose between erasing pressure on people and increasing pressure on Congress to protect his political position, he does not choose the people. He chooses himself. And, this is where the politics of this get very interesting. Because despite Trump's apparent motive here, despite his desire to protect Republican control and keep Congress from, falling into Democratic hands, this move could end up handing Democrats one of the cleanest midterm messages they're ever going to get. I mean, the attack ad writes itself. Congress passed a bipartisan housing bill. Donald Trump held it hostage for election law changes. That's it. That's the whole thing. No 37-step explanation, no whiteboard, no need to bring in a man with rolled up sleeves and a pointer stick. No need to say, stay with me here, which is always what politicians say right before the audience begins to quietly nod off. This one is simple. You need help with housing. Congress passed a bill. Trump said no, not unless I get what I want. That should be politically potent because it demonstrates a direct connection between the thing people feel and the thing Trump did. And Democrats, if they have a shred of survival instinct left at all, should pound this like a drum. Because one of the great failures of Democratic messaging, to my mind, is that they often take an issue that should be simple and run it through, a committee until it comes out sounding like a grant application. They say something like, this administration's decision to delay implementation of a bipartisan affordability framework underscores the need for comprehensive governance rooted in working family priorities. Oh, no. Stop it. Put down the thesaurus. The message is this. Trump put his power over your needs. That's the ad. That's the mailer. That's the debate line. That's the clip right there. That is the phrase that should be stapled to every Republican who tries to campaign on affordability while defending this kind of political hostage taking. Because Republicans are going to try to have it both ways. They're going to say they care about costs, and they care about working people, and they care about families, and they care about rent and groceries and gas and a trip to the dentist, because at some point in America, teeth apparently became a luxury. But if they defend this move by Trump, they are defending the idea that housing relief can wait until Trump gets an election bill. That's the trap. And it is a trap Trump set for his own party. There are Republican members of Congress who voted for this housing bill, a lot of them. The vote totals were overwhelming, and that means Republicans went home or planned to go home and say, look, I did something on housing. They could point to a bipartisan bill, tell voters they worked on affordability. Then Trump walked in and turned the whole thing into a loyalty test. Now they have to explain why a bill they supported is suddenly acceptable as a bargaining chip. I mean, talk about awkward. I mean, at least it should be. In a normal political environment, this would create real pressure inside the party. Members from competitive districts would be furious. Campaign staff would be, chewing the drywall. Local reporters would be asking very simple questions that are very hard to answer without sounding ridiculous. Congressman, you voted for the housing bill. Do you agree with President Trump delaying it until Congress passes this election bill? There's no good answer. I mean, a lot of them will say fake news and, you're attacking me. But it wouldn't be an attack. It's a pretty logical question, and there is no good answer. If they say yes, they're saying housing relief should be conditional on Trump's, political demands. If they say no, then they're crossing Trump. And of course, in today's Republican Party, crossing Trump is not treat it like disagreement. It's treat it like we'll wander into the village square with a sandwich board that reads primary me. That's the irony. Trump may be trying to protect Republican control by forcing action on election rules, and his indifference to what people need right now could be the very thing that damages what he's trying to shield. The need right now is not abstract. People are not sitting around saying, what would help my family? A more satisfying procedural fight over voter registration documentation. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, am I going to be able to afford rent this month? Can my kid move out? Are we ever going to be able to buy a house? Are we going to have to move far away? Can we make it another year without the landlord raising our rent again? That's the real world people are living in. And Trump just gave Democrats a sentence that connects that world to his wants and needs. He took housing help and made it about him. And it should be devastating. The question is whether our politics are still capable of treating it that way. Because in a normal timeline, this kind of move could cripple the Republican Party. In a normal timeline, a president refusing or delaying a bipartisan housing bill during an affordability crisis because he wants an unrelated election bill first would be nothing short of a political wound. Not a scratch, a wound. You would expect voters to punish it. You would expect members of his own party, especially the ones in competitive districts, to start backing away slowly, like, they spotted a skunk in the garden. You would expect local news to hammer them. You would expect Democrats to hammer them. Town halls to get uncomfortable in a hurry. And maybe some of that will happen. It certainly should. But, we don't live in a normal timeline. We live in a political environment where Trump can act directly against the material interest of his own supporters, and many of them won't blame him. They'll just blame whoever he points at. It is one of the most durable features of the MAGA movement. Trump does not have to solve the problem if he can control the blame. It's too expensive. Oh, blame the Democrats. Healthcare is unaffordable. Oh, well, you got to blame Obama for that one. Housing bill delayed. Blame election fraud, the deep state, the media, or whatever villain gets pulled from the outrage vending machine that day. And that is not because all of his supporters are uniquely bad people or uniquely unintelligent. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that in there, but attributing it all to that is just too easy. And frankly, it lets the machinery off the hook. The problem is the MAGA media ecosystem is built to separate cause from effect. It's built to take the pain people feel and redirect it away from power. People feel squeezed, angry, anxious, and disrespected. Those feelings are real. The rent is real. The grocery bill is real. The exhaustion is real. The sense that the system is rigged for somebody else is in many ways completely justified. Then Trump comes along and says, yes, you are right to be angry, but not at me. Look over there. And over there is always someone weaker, someone more vulnerable, an immigrant, a trans kid, a teacher, a librarian, a judge, a civil servant, a protester, a journalist, a poor person who supposedly gets too much help, or a disabled person whose caretaker is, fraudulent. Anyone but the people actually holding power. That's how the trick works. It doesn't make life cheaper. It doesn't build housing. It doesn't lower rent or make insurance affordable. It doesn't help your kid get their first home. It gives anger a different target. And in politics these days, the target is often treated as the substitute for the solution. That's why Trump can thumb his nose at what people need and still expect MAGA to toe the line. The movement has trained people to see loyalty as wisdom, to treat criticism of Trump as an attack on them, to believe that any fact making him look bad must be part of a plot, and any politician who crosses him must be weak, corrupt, disloyal, or secretly working for the enemy. So yeah, this should hurt Republicans. It should be a problem. A president holding up housing help for political protection demands should be politically toxic. But should is carrying a lot of weight these days. Should is out there doing bench presses with Pete Hegseth. Because we've seen this pattern before. Trump creates the problem, worsens the problem, or refuses to solve the problem, and then blames someone else for the pain. Then his base rallies around him because admitting the truth would mean admitting they were used. Nobody wants to believe they were conned. Nobody wants to believe the man who said he was fighting for them is actually using their anger as fuel. Nobody wants to look at the wreckage and have to ask, maybe does that guy holding the match have something to do with this fire? So they double down. They toe the line. They defend the indefensible. And Trump gets away with treating their needs like background noise. That's the danger. Not just that one housing bill became a bargaining chip, but that even something this obviously egregious won't break the spell. There is nothing in this housing bill that hurts Trump in any way. There is no real negative to addressing the issue that people are struggling with, yet he's willing to hold it hostage. Even this may not be enough for people to say, wait a minute, if he cared about affordability, why did he hold up the affordability bill? That's the question. And it is the question Democrats need to repeat over and over and over until their teeth ache. Not with jargon, not with, policy soup, not with, charts, just plainly. If Donald Trump cares about what you can afford, why did he hold up the housing bill? So that's where this lands. Not in the fine print of the bill, not in the full mechanics of the SAVE Act, not in another round of Washington procedural smog where everyone talks so long that the original point gets lost. The moral question is simple. What kind of president looks at this bill and sees only leverage? What kind of politics takes the pressure people are feeling, the rent, the mortgage, the down payment, all of it, and turns that into a bargaining chip? Housing affordability is not theoretical. It's not a crowbar for one man's midterm panic. Housing is the roof over people's lives. And when Congress, against all odds, manages to pass something that might help, the president's job is not to stand there with a smirk and a list of unrelated demands. The president's job is to decide whether helping people matters on its own. And it's a test that Trump keeps failing. Not because he lacks slogans. Oh, he's got slogans, he's got hats, he's got flags, he's got dog whistles, he has chants. He has all the stage dressing of a movement that claims to speak for working people. But when the moment comes to actually do something useful, the calculation always seems to bend back towards him. His power and protection, his revenge, his fear, his survival. and everyone else just gets told to wait. It's not populism. It's not strength. It's certainly not leadership. That's a man holding the public good hostage because he's terrified of losing the shield around himself. So if Republicans want to keep talking about affordability, fine, I guess. Let them talk. But this stunt by Trump is the reply. Congress passed bipartisan housing help, and Trump held it hostage. And when a president looks at the roof over your head and sees nothing but leverage, you are not being governed. You are being used. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm both grateful and thrilled that you did. And I would love to hear from you on this topic, certainly, but on any topic that I've covered or that you think I should cover in an episode. Critiques, compliments, whatever you want to share, I want to hear. If you go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, you'll find the contacts page. You can DM through social media or email. You can go to the episodes section and stream or download any episode of the podcast. And go to the blog section, because those posts that mirror the topics of the podcast include all of my sources, which I think is very important these days. It's Friday, so I'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.